To begin your color wheel, you're going to need primary colors, yellow, red, and blue, as well as a container of water to wash your brushes, a paintbrush, and some kind of rag or paper towel. What you're going to do first is block in the primary colors themselves, because we already have those colors here on our palette. So I'm going to start with my lightest color, yellow, and just loosely paint that in. And then before I go to my next color, I'm going to wash my brush thoroughly in the water and dry it on my rag. And now I'm going to move over to my red. The red is a bit of a thin pigment, so when you first put it on the white paper, you may find it turns a little bit pink. Don't worry too much about that. We're going to add another layer on afterwards. And once again, I'm going to wash and dry my brush. And now finally the blue. And wash and dry my brush again. So now that we've established the three primary colors, what we're going to do next is add in our secondaries and tertiaries. So I'm going to be working from yellow across to blue first of all. So I'm going to take my palette and I'm going to grab a bit of my yellow and scoop it to the side, because I don't want to change all of my yellow into green, because I'm going to need my yellow again when I'm mixing my oranges. So now that I've got my yellow pulled aside, I'm just going to grab just from the edge of the blue with the very corner of my brush, I don't need much, a little tiny bit of blue. It doesn't take much blue to turn yellow into green, so I'm not even going to use all of that. I'm just going to use a little tiny bit of it, and I'm going to mix until I have a very light yellow-green. I'm not even using the entire amount of yellow I used. I stop once I've mixed the right amount, and then I can go in and establish my yellow-green. Now I'm going to turn that yellow-green into actual green by slowly, incrementally adding a little bit more blue at a time. You don't want to add too much at once, because then you might push it too far. To get a true secondary, what you're aiming for is a color where when you're looking at it, you can't decide if it's more yellow or more blue. So I think that looks about right. And that's my green. And next up, I'm going to introduce a little bit more blue to create a blue-green. And I might need to go over here and grab a little bit more from the edge. And again, I'm not mixing up my entire amount. I'm just mixing it until I see the right color. And then I can block in my blue-green. And when I'm putting this down, I think that's not quite blue enough, so I'm going to add a little bit more. Because sometimes the paint will look a little bit different on the page than it does in your palette. That's better. So now I've got my yellow to blue established. I'm going to wash and dry my brush again. And I'm going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to go from yellow to red. So like I did before, I'm going to grab some of this yellow, I'm going to scoop it aside so that I'm not contaminating all of my yellow. And then I'm going to grab just from the edge of the red, tiny little amount of red, and mix it with that yellow until I get a yellow-orange. And because yellow is such a weak pigment, again, it does not take much red at all. So there's my yellow-orange. And now I'm going to introduce a little bit more red to make my true orange. And as before, I want to make a color where when I look at it, I can't decide whether it's more yellow or more red. And that's looking a little bit light as I'm laying it down on my page, so I'm going to go back and add a little bit more red to it. This paint is fairly thin paint, so sometimes it's just a matter of adding another coat. And now finally I'm going for my red orange. So I'm going to push this orange quite far towards red. And I'm going to lay that down. So that should be a color that's close to red, but still leaning a little bit towards orange. Now at this point, my red has had a chance to dry. So I'm going to go back and add an extra layer of red, because again, this red pigment can be very thin at times, I find. So adding another layer will make my red actually look red. So my last piece of the color wheel I've got to do is my red to blue range. And the purples are actually the hardest colors to mix, especially with these paints because they're not the best quality, but we're going to do our best. So red is the weaker pigment here. So we're going to start with red and pull a bit aside and grab the most itty bitty amount of blue. And even that was too much. That's actually not quite as reddish a purple as I want. So I'm going to pull a bit more in. That's better. And I'm going to add that in on my red purple. And now a little bit more to get to my true purple, which again is the trickiest color to mix. That's looking pretty good right there. It's so dark on the palette that often it's hard to tell whether it's right or not, and you won't know until you put it on white paper. See, that's way too blue. So I'm gonna pull my too blue purple back into some red and try again. That's looking a bit more reasonable. It's not uncommon for the purple to get so dark that it looks black. So if that does happen, don't panic. Just kind of spread it around a little bit. There's my purple. And then finally my blue purple, which is going to be the darkest tone on the color wheel. Adding a little bit more blue to the purple I made. And I'll lay that down. So that's my completed color wheel. I am going to add another layer on the blue as well, because I find the blue is a little bit thin too sometimes. But otherwise the colors are looking pretty good. And again, our aim here is to have fairly even steps in between the colors. The biggest mistakes people tend to make is they'll make their yellow-green and their yellow-orange much too dark. So watch out for that. And make sure that your secondary colors, again, are right in between the two. And if after they dry, they end up looking too light, like for instance, my green is looking a little bit suspect, I can go in and add a second coat to make it look more true to the secondary. Because again, it should be exactly in between blue and yellow as much as possible. So when you're done your color wheel, your next step is to do your color schemes. So a lot of these colors you're already going to have on your palette, which is why I want you to do these all at once. The first one is a monochromatic color scheme. And monochromatic colors are basically tints and shades of the same color. And that means basically adding either black or white to the color. So I'm going to use blue for this. So to create a light blue, I'm going to scoop some white off to the side. And I'm going to add an itty bitty amount of blue to that white to make a kind of light sky blue tone. And I'll throw that down there. And then for the one in the middle, I'm just going to add a little bit more darker blue. I don't want it to be super dark, I just want it to be a mid-tone. That goes in the middle. And then my darkest blue. Blue's already pretty dark, but I'm going to make it even darker. I'm going to grab some blue and I'm going to add the most teeny tiniest amount of black to make kind of a navy blue tone. And that is a monochromatic color scheme. So next up we're going to do analogous colors, and they're colors that are side by side on the color wheel. So you could go kind of yellow to green to blue, you could go yellow to orange to red, you could go red to purple to blue. I'm going to do yellow to orange to red, because I've already got those on my palette here, so I'm going to grab sort of a yellowy orange color. And then beside it I'm going to put kind of a more of an orange or reddish orange. And then finally a red. So that's an example of an analogous color scheme, which are very close to each other, and they sort of create a natural harmony. For complementary colors, they're opposite on the color wheel. So like red and green, blue and orange, purple and violet, or you could do something like red, purple to yellow, green. I'm going to do red and green because I've got those colors readily mixed here. So throw my green down here. Wash my brush because these are opposite colors. If they mix together, they're going to make gray or brown. So I need to make sure that I don't contaminate them. And then throwing in the red next. So that is a complementary color scheme. It is extremely high contrast. Now we're getting into the more complicated ones. Split complementary basically means you take a color and you go across the color wheel, but instead of choosing its complementary, you choose the two tertiary colors to either side. So I'm going to go blue to yellow orange and red orange. So color number one is just my regular primary blue. Wash my brush because I don't want to get blue in my orange. And then I'm going to throw down my yellow orange. And then my red orange. And the advantage of a split complementary color scheme is that you tend to get a slightly more natural and interesting look than you would if you just use the complementary, which is sometimes a little bit too high contrast. My red orange has gotten a little bit too red here, so I'm just taking some yellow and brushing it directly over top and mixing on the page until it becomes more of a red orange. And then finally, a triadic color scheme is any three equally spaced colors on the color wheel. So that could be red, blue, and yellow. It could be purple, orange, and green. Or it could be red, purple, yellow, orange, and blue, green. To keep things simple, I'm just going to use the three secondary colors. So I'm going to put down green, purple, and orange as my triadic color scheme. Make sure you wash your brush in between all of these colors because they're very different from each other. You don't want to muddy them up. So that's my green. Next up comes my orange, which again is already on my palette. Wash my brush again. And then finally, as best as I can here, my purple. So that's just a quick overview of color schemes and how to mix colors on a color wheel.